Holla ballers, what's going on? It's Preacher. Sorry if I sound funny, I'm still ridiculously ill. But of course, the healing discussion has been raging for the past week or so. In fact, when I did my big Q&A after story time, then most of that was actually focused on the healing changes and whether or not they will be effective. And I was kind of openly negative towards them in terms of, no, I don't really think this is going to cure the problems, and mainly that was because we had seen these promises in the past. We saw them at the end of Wrath of the Lich King, we saw it at the end of Kata, and then we saw them again now. So, what are the healing problems? Especially for those of you who are prospective healers looking to move into this sort of style of raiding. Perhaps you're done with DPS. Perhaps you've realised that, you know, I actually want to be more of a team player than actually relying on my own personal worthiness in a raid in order to combine and contribute towards that raid. Healers indicatively play differently towards the DPS and the tanks. In fact, I would go as far as to say healing is one of the most thankless jobs that goes on in gaming, but they certainly appeal to a certain type of player. That player being the one who is less of the competitive nature and really looking towards that teamwork contribution. What healers want, and this is where the crux of the problem comes from, what most of the top-end healers want is to be even. What they don't want to be is the guy who's storming ahead. They don't want to play Batman, and they certainly don't want to be Robin either. What they want is to be even with their friends and also contributing enough each so that they're not feeling worthless. One of the problems, of course, that raids do, and rightfully so, is they look for as soon as possible to start dropping healers in order to bring in more DPS. If bosses can die faster and reliably, then of course that's something people should opt for. But we're not seeing that in Mists of Pandaria. We're seeing various problems, and in fact what I had to do, because I'm not an expert on this subject, is I rallied the troops. I got in a lot of heroic healers. I had to, because I just didn't have that much experience with them in Mists of Pandaria. I didn't heal a great deal, but of course I want to give you reliable, informative information. So, I rallied the troops and we had a big old nerdy debate about healing and various problems therein. One of the big key problems right now is Absorb, something that Blizzard has promised to address in various ways, such as the fact that bosses and attacks will come sort of lighter but faster, which nullifies Absorbs in a little bit more of a tedious way. But if you're not sure of what the problems are, I got a couple from my friend Blubs of logs of the same fight side by side, one where a dishealer was brought and one where one wasn't. And what you can see is if we look at the one where the dishealer wasn't brought, the healers are reasonably even. This is Norishen Heroic. Reasonably even. The Paladin's a little bit low, but he's under-geared, and so on and so forth, but pretty close to each other. Now, if we look at a Disc Priest, you can see he actually dominated. We started to see that Batman thing happening. The Disc Priest came in and actually pulled 540k HPS, miles above the other healers. Absolutely incredibly far ahead, to the point of ridiculousness. On top of that, if we then checked his damage done, it gets even worse because he brought an extra 120k DPS to the raid, which is just absurd. Absolutely absurd. 130k for all intents and purposes, which is just crazy. Absolutely crazy. You might say, yeah, but he's at the bottom of the DPS, Preacher. Well, just imagine your top DPS is doing another 100k on top of that, and then you might see why that is a problem. You can see the power a Disc Priest is bringing, the fact that it's actually making healers feel less useful, and in fact making them really bored. Was the general comeback is that, look, when a Disc Priest comes into the raid, I feel like an asshole because Disc Priest is bringing a lot of damage, and on top of that, he's also smashing me to pieces on the healing, and I'm basically picking up his scraps. Absorbs have been a problem since they were first discovered back in Wrath of the Lich King. Around about Ulduar time, Absorbs came to prominence. I specifically remember Steelbreaker I Choose You being the big moment where Absorbs were, wow, this thing is pretty crazy. Obviously, a simplified version of it is, if you can heal for 500k, that's nowhere near as good as absorbing for 500k, because there's far less chance of you dying if you just absorb the damage and still have full HP, rather than taking the damage and then needing to be healed. There's an obvious problem there. And this Absorb thing is actually bad for the Disc Priests as well. Most of the Disc Priests in the very top end don't even enjoy playing it. It's boring. It's really boring. Some people like it, of course, and every time we have one of these discussions, I don't want people to get offended by saying, well, I like it, you're not speaking for everybody. Of course, we're talking in some generalized terms here. But what you can see is their power is just overwhelming. Not to be playing on a term in the game, but their power is overwhelming, and you can't compete. You can't compete with this level of problems, to the point where some of these guys who I talked to actually believe that the fights in Siege of Orgrimmar Heroic were balanced around Disc Priest, not healing, not damage, not cooldowns, but were balanced around the idea that Disc Priest will be in the raid. Specifically, in the early days of Paragons of the Calaxian AIM, many of them believe that without a Disc Priest, that ability is ridiculously RNG. Very few little abilities need to go off, and the people who are caught by AIM could die. Whereas the Disc Priest trivialized the whole thing. We have seen in the past things like Infest on Arthas, which could only really be dealt with by a Disc Priest. Many abilities throughout the game have been balanced around the idea that a Disc Priest is available, and forcing priests who might have rolled to be a healer but certainly want to go holy to actually play Discipline because of its power and its strengths. There's nothing worse than being forced to play a spec because it's so powerful, especially when your other options are supposed to do something similar. Really a bad time for everyone. On top of that, we have the classic problem, don't we? The classic problem. The problem is we just don't care about mana. Some classes still do to an extent. Resto Druids, Paladins kind of still worry a little bit about mana, but certainly if you're playing a Resto Shaman, a Monk, or a Priest, mana is so irrelevant that you could just spam any spell all day, every day without any worries at all. And that gets boring as well, because you don't even really care. In fact, you can fall very easily into having a set rotation, where you're using very inefficient spells on cooldown. And certainly I've been guilty of sort of promoting this to you guys in various guides over Mists of Pandaria, is, hey, you should be using these spells on cooldown, because one, they're inefficient, but mana doesn't matter, so you can go ahead and use these spells on cooldown to get some effect out of them, and then keep producing those spells more and more throughout the fight. So that's the current problems of healers, if you weren't aware. Disc Priest dominating, making the other healers feel irrelevant. I mean, to the point, we need to clarify just 100% how bad this is. Every time your Disc Priest gets a piece of gear, he effectively makes every other healer worse. Because as his absorbs become more powerful, as more damage is prevented, then the power of the other healers is diminished. There is a really negative impact on gearing up your Discipline Priest for the other healers. Only imagine, as a DPS player or a tank, that if you got a piece of gear, that effectively made all the rest of your DPS do less. Not do more, or not do the same as they did previously, but effectively do less. Imagine if your friend the rogue was getting a new dagger, and that actually meant that you did less damage than you did before, despite your gear level being even. You can imagine now why that's not a lot of fun. So Blizz is once again putting out its feelers and its touches to say, look, we know there's a problem, alright? We know there's an issue. We're gonna fix it. First and foremost, we're going to just flat out reduce the effectiveness of heals. We're going to flat out do it. Now, what I'm not going to do is read through the notes. You guys can obviously click that. I'll put the link down below so you can click it. But there's various ideas here. Less instant cast. Absorbs in general is just going to be toned way the fuck down. We're going to be using different types of damage that nullify absorbs, as we talked about before. We're going to kind of drop out really efficient spells. In fact, they're just completely cutting out various spells like Nourish, Holy Light, and Heal. They're just going. They're just getting the fuck out of there because they're too easy and too spammy. The reason I don't really believe in this, as I said before, is we've seen it before, and what you ultimately can't stop is healers getting gear. And the more gear they get, the more powerful they become. The issue itself seems to be lying the mechanics for me. And that's the discussion we should have today, is the mechanics. Certainly absorbs just either need to be flat out removed or made pretty much irrelevant. Real emergency. I would love to see Power Word Shield being much more powerful, but on a really major cooldown, so you could actually count on it when you needed it, but you can't spam that shit out there. Divine Aegis isn't just something I can plop out whenever the fuck I feel like it, because it's so powerful. And again, as it gets more powerful, which is an inevitable consequence of the gear progressing and the raid progressing and the expansion growing and developing, this is unstoppable. If you're going to have this heavy mechanic in there, this ability to prevent damage, that's going to get more powerful as the expansion goes on. And that's always been the big problem. We start the expansions kind of balanced, kind of even, but then suddenly it all goes downhill because the separation in power grows and grows as the expansion develops and goes on. I'm always very, very wary. I just want to mention this, is when Blizzard ever mentions an old expansion, please, for the love of God, especially if you didn't play it or didn't play that spec, take that with a pinch of salt. It's very easy, like the guy who got fired. Classic thing in the workplace is if a guy gets fired, is you blame everything on him, despite the fact that it probably wasn't his fault. When I read that Blizzard was kind of openly saying, oh, Kata was too hard. Do you remember how Kata started? It was a big fucking deal, right? Well, as a raid leader during Kata, especially jumping into heroics very early on, I had 3 main healers and 1 off-spec healer. None of them ever came to me with problems regarding mana, even on some of the most mana-intensive fights in the game at that time, such as Chimera on heroic, topping an entire raid super quickly, and of course, Halphus Wormbreaker, which would just put out ludicrous amounts of random damage. Mana wasn't the big problem. So I asked the guys, because they all healed in Kata, was Kata like that? Because you guys never came to me with this problem. You never approached me and said, you know what, we just don't have the mana to deal with this. No, it was not a big deal. And therefore this false, not false particularly, but this kind of rose-tinted look, a nostalgic look at Kata healing being very difficult, and people, I think one of them even call themselves a survivor of the Cataclysm early healing, a survivor, are a little bit exaggerated to say the least. A little bit crazy there. I don't know where the fuck that's coming from, man. It wasn't like that. No matter how many times they try and twist it, it wasn't like that. What you might have there, and something I can relate to, is people who started in Wrath, where mana was a complete non-issue from very early on in the expansion, and then jumped into Kata, where mana was kind of a thing, then yeah, maybe you found it a little bit difficult, but surely not long term. And I certainly wouldn't like to look at Kata and say, yeah, that we did it wrong there, it was too hard, because it wasn't. In fact, a lot of the problems of Kata healing were class-based, rather than being a case of mana management. Mana management is always a good thing. It makes people interested in the buttons they're pressing, and God knows we want to be interested in the buttons we're pressing when we have an extensive toolkit like most healers do. But yeah, class issues were the big problem there, especially when Paladins just got Light of Dawn and could put out tremendous amounts of burst AoE healing. Resto Druids were more than fine. But then you had the Resto Shaman who didn't have things like Spirit Link Totem. They didn't have very powerful AoE healing and just simply couldn't keep up. Not a case that they were running out of mana and couldn't cast anything, but they just couldn't keep up. And that was a class-based thing rather than a mechanics of the actual healers themselves overall. So very wary of this Cataclysm look back as, oh, it was too hard. You know, we couldn't deal with it. In fact, I remember I rolled, I did many guides. I think even in Kata I did the guide where I healed the end time heroics wearing no gear on my Paladin, just to show that it's not a case of that. The way it works with the mana efficient spells is more than enough to let anybody deal with it. And certainly from the very first heroic raids, healers were fine. It just heavily revolved around class mechanics and cooldowns. Paladin's absorption shields and Paladin cooldowns was certainly something to be watched for compared to the warriors who weren't bringing such a spell. And that isn't something that was a core problem of healers themselves. Healers want simple things. I tend to find. Some of you will disagree, some of you will be the competitive nature of being a healer. I often find that really competitive healers don't last very long in the top end guilds. It might be something you want to watch. But healers just want to be even. They want to be contributing. What they don't want is capable of putting out 500k HPS and only able to put out 50, because then they're just going to be replaced. They don't really want that either. No healers want to be benched, because again, they play a different kind of game. They don't really want to, a lot of them don't want to be DPS. And those that do tend to complain to be DPS more often than they want to be a healer. It tends to be what I find where it differentiates sometimes. Interesting discussion. The reason, again, I just don't buy it. I just don't buy it because these mechanics might be nerfed, they might be changed, they might be switched around, but they still exist. They still exist. Absorbs are a huge problem because eventually they just become powerful. You can't stop that unless you're going to constantly nerf them every time they get more gear, in which case, what's the fucking point, right? Smart heals we've discussed in the past. Instant casts, sure, I can see a reason that people want to be thinking about position more, that's fine. But overall, I don't know. I can't help but read this and think, yeah, you've said this stuff before, man, and it didn't really work out. What I want to see is predictable damage that makes healers coordinate, because they love that. They really like predictable damage, saying, you know what, in 25 seconds we need to get ready for stuff. But I know that nothing crazy is going to happen in the next 25 seconds, so I can use my mana efficient stuff. I want to use my mana efficient stuff safely, rather than the way it ends up now in Siege of Orgrimmar, which is if you don't top someone up instantaneously, they're going to die. In which case everyone's just sniping each other, and how can you blame healers and raids wanting to bring huge absorb shields when people can die so quickly? Look at the Dark Shaman. Hell, look at the Iron Juggernaut. If people aren't topped immediately and with absorb shields, they can die so freaking fast. And therefore healers are just sniping each other all the goddamn time. Not fun, guys. Really not fun. What we want is, hey, in 30 seconds, this shit's going down. Let's prepare for it, team. What plans have we got, healers? What are we going to do? And in between there, we'll just top people off, play it cool, and get ready for this next big thing. Interesting ideas, guys. Well, those are my thoughts on it. Let's see yours. I'll see you later, guys. Bye.